Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Takstashila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of All Things Policy. My name is Kripa Koshy, and I'm a staff program manager here at Takshashila. And I'm joined today actually by my colleague, Bhumika, who's going to help me uncover a pretty interesting topic, I'm hoping, today. But before I welcome Bhumika, I'm just going to formally introduce her. For those who might not be aware, Bhumika Sevkani is a research analyst with the Geostrategy program at Takshashila. And her work primarily focuses on China's new energy sector, which is good news for us because that means she knows exactly what she's talking about for our topic today. But welcome, Bhumika. Lovely to have you.
Thanks, Kripa. Glad to be here.
Super. So, okay, it's going to come as no surprise then. Today's topic of discussion is going to be China's energy security. So I'm just going to jump right into our discussion. I know there's a lot that's been said largely about China and its decisions around energy. And we know largely that, its oil dependence, for example, is a sectoral dependence rather than a systemic dependence, right? So we know that major sectors like manufacturing and fertilizers are depending on sort of these, on oil consumption. So would you help us maybe understand how, we know of China's strategic oil reserve and such. How do you think this feeds into helping manage some of these shocks that are coming up as we see with this ongoing war in West Asia?
Right. Thanks, Kripa, for that question. So let's just begin by zooming out a little, right? Just to put China's energy security in context. So there has been rapid electrification, and they've also focused on diversifying their energy consumption mix. So two things that we can look at to understand China's energy security is their domestic energy consumption mix and their imports. So starting with the energy mix, one key point to note is that coal continues to anchor China's energy security, and it accounts for about 51.6% of the total primary energy consumption, with most of it produced domestically. So that already gives it sort of a very stable sort of a mix, which is less reliant on imports. But simultaneously, we also have their renewable energy resources. We know that China has been massively adopting renewable energy resources in their energy needs. So the clean energy sources, including hydropower, wind, solar, all of these contribute over 30% of the mix, owing to their state-driven energy transition that's been taking place, I think, over a decade now. So that's also, again, if we look at that, 80% of their energy needs are already met domestically that way. But then if we look at the crude oil, which constitutes about another 20% of the consumption mix, China imports around 70% of its crude oil. But again, as I said, it constitutes less than 1/5 of the total energy consumption mix. So the scale of the import vulnerability here appears more contained. And just to build on this, China's oil import structure is also relatively diversified. So diversification in both energy consumption sources as well as import sources. So they've made sure that less than 20% of imports come from any single source. So as the Chinese like to call it, they have this phrase where they want to hold the energy rice bowl in their hands. So they've made sure to not depend on any single source for even their crude oil imports. But again, West Asia here collectively accounts for 42% of imports, which is around 4.9 million barrels per day. Even if within that, if we look country-wise, so Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Oman, and Kuwait are some of their major supply sources for crude oil in the West Asia. But again, none of them go beyond sort of 15% of their supply, right? So Iran also contributes another 12% or about 1.38 million barrels per day. So that is the kind of loss that we're seeing in terms of their supply every day. And this is still a huge number considering China consumes 16 million barrels per day, even though oil accounts for so little in their energy consumption mix. To just put this consumption in context, India consumes about 5 million barrels per day, and share of crude oil in our energy mix is about 30%. So 16 million barrels per day of consumption is still a huge number. And so these import sources, although diversified, matter a lot, right? Yeah. So now if you were also to look at the shifting consumption patterns, as you mentioned, that it's sectoral rather than systemic. So I think in about last 5 years, the consumption patterns within China for crude oil have also been shifting. So China drove over 60% of global oil demand growth between 2013 to 2023. But for the last year's increase, it only accounted for less than 20% of the growth. So there's overall a reduction in oil demand in the country. And this can be due to various sort of reasons. One is, of course, the inclusion of renewables in the mix. Again, there's also the factor of coal gasification being increased, and there's also a slump in the construction sector, which has historically driven the demand for conventional fuels. And alongside, there's also sluggish consumer spending, which is linked to gasoline use so all of these things have made China's recent GDP growth less fuel intensive. But growth in oil demand is increasingly driven by petrochemicals here. So this sector already consumes about 3.7 million barrels per day, and it is set to increase about 47% in the coming year itself. And that is also because China is underway in adopting a policy of sort of exporting these petrochemicals. So there's also a push in producing petrochemicals in China. So, and apart from there's also LNG and LPG in the mix that we can come to later. So let's just look at, to answer your question on how they are absorbing these short-term shocks. As I mentioned, that West Asia still accounts for about 42% of their oil supply. So mainly two things. First, their reserves, and second is regulating domestic prices, right? So to absorb the short-term shocks, China has also built significant reserves. The country increased its crude oil imports and stockpiling rate massively in 2025. So the country's total crude oil reserves are estimated to be between 1.1 to 1.3 billion barrels. And so this volume offers an additional import cover of about 110 to 140 days at current consumption levels, which exceeds the International Energy Agency's required 90-day mandate, right? So again, this provides China with a temporary buffer against supply crisis, and there might be additional volumes of crude oil held in floating and bonded storage, which further sort of extends this cushion. So, and in response to supply constraints, China has also restricted exports of refined fuels. So that can be then diverted to their domestic sectors of manufacturing, transport, and petrochemicals. And lastly, there's also the National Development and Reform Commission, which has stepped in to regulate refined oil prices. And this is, I think, just this Tuesday, it was announced that they'll be capping the domestic refined oil prices. And this is, I think, the second time that they've stepped in after this supply crisis. So this is how they're managing the short-term shocks. Yeah.
No, it's a fairly comprehensive response, Bhumika. Thank you so much. And I think you touched on some really salient sort of features of what China's energy landscape looks like. And one thing I was hoping to touch on a little bit was the energy mix point, right? So we know, for example, that IEA's research is telling us that in 2024, China's clean energy investment was more than $625 billion. This was almost double since the estimate in 2015. China's achieved its 2030 wind and solar capacity target in 2024, which is actually 6 years ahead of schedule. And we know that China is now trying to formalize this dual track approach and investment in both coal and renewable energy in tandem. So how would you sort of see reconciling these investments? We know that coal continues to anchor a lot of China's energy security, but how do you sort of reconcile their investments in these two different directions?
Right. So as you mentioned, Kripa, right, that it's a dual track approach. They want to, and they have invested quite a lot in renewables. That they've become a leading sort of country in adopting and manufacturing renewable energy equipment. So the IEA's point about more about investing so much in clean energy investment in 2024, it reflects how fast China is building new supply chains. How fast they're investing in factories, grids, storage, as well as the equipments or EVs, right? So, but that investment mostly is aimed at changing the future energy system. But it does not instantly remove the need for the current one, right? We know that coal still forms a large part of the energy consumption mix, and it anchors reliability and price stability in the entire energy system for China, right? So the 51.6 figure for coal about for primary energy consumption, which is broader than electricity alone. This also includes industrial heat, heavy industry, and other uses where coal is harder to displace as quickly, right? And in other words, that coal's share can remain dominant even while wind, solar, batteries, and electrification grow rapidly in the power sector. So China's energy policy then is built around both security and decarbonization. So coal helps meet the energy security aspect, whereas the focus on renewables going ahead helps them meet decarbonization aspect, at least until they sort of find out a way to make renewables more reliable and sort of constant in terms of their supply of energy. We know that renewables can be intermittent and they can pose a challenge to grid stabilization and their management. So unless they can come up with the infrastructure, sort of economy-wide infrastructure where renewables can easily be then sort of increased in the energy mix, and then they might shed their reliance on coal gradually. But again, in terms of investments in coal as well, for now we know that the country is continuing to add significant coal power capacity. Just in 2025, they added a record of 95 gigawatts of coal power capacity to the grid, and the country has more projects lined up for coal power going ahead. And this is also sort of increasing with their use of coal gasification, where they produce synthetic gas using coal and then they supply that gas to the industries. So that is again, the adoption of coal gasification is again in an uptick in China. So which is why most analysts describe China's transition as layering clean energy on top of coal. So, and not simply replacing coal outright. So here, again, they will continue to accelerate clean energy build out as fast as possible. Also, given the economic opportunities that it provides to them, we know that they've been dominating the share of solar panels, wind energy equipments, as well as EVs going ahead. And that has also significantly contributed to their GDP. So I think both of these sort of sources are going to receive a lot of attention, especially after this supply crisis from Iran.
So I was just going to double click a little bit on, because essentially we're talking about a diversification, right? Not a heavy-handed reliance on a singular source. And so that is a pretty sort of relevant feature also of China's energy security, is the fact that they've intentionally chosen to diversify a lot of their supply sources, right? So we were speaking now of some of their consumption here. But could you elaborate on a little bit of this? Like, in theory, it sounds like a good idea to be diversifying, a lot of these sources, but would you see any possible limitations to this approach?
So ultimately, we know that it's not about achieving complete self-sufficiency, right, in China. And it is ensuring that even if there's dependence, it does not translate into vulnerability, which is why they were focusing on sourcing less than 20% from any single country. But in case of West Asia, which went on to account for 42% of the oil imports, The issue was that even if there was a diversification of sourcing within the countries, there was still this critical maritime choke point
at the region. So the entire area is in fact impacted.
The Strait of Hormuz. So even if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, no imports from West Asia can come to China, right? And so I think that is one vulnerability that has come to light. And but again, there has also been a step up by Russia, which is widely being referred to as a credible alternative source for most Asian economies, including China. The war, I think, has increased the significance of its supply sources. So in 2025, China imported roughly 17.4% of its total oil imports.
Coming very close to that 20 mark.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that was the import from Russia. But even if they increase it a little bit during the supply crisis, it cannot alone fill the gap of the West Asian supplies, which was about 4.6 million barrels, right? So despite the diversification in supply sources, China still remains vulnerable due to the massive consumption scale that I mentioned above, and that consumption being focused in the economic sector, in the sectors that contribute sort of highly to its economy. So about the LNG and LPG sources, as I was mentioning above, these two energy sources in the mix are also quite important. So while the LNG is quite diversified in terms of sourcing, they source it from Australia, Qatar, Russia, Malaysia, and Indonesia. But their LPG again is coming mostly from West Asia. So that is another sort of choke point that they've come to develop. So, but apart from that as well, the rising global crude oil prices will anyway impact their domestic prices and economy, which is why we see TNDRC step in, right? So just to sum it up, for crude oil and LPG, West Asia remains the weak point, and the Strait of Hormuz is a bottleneck that is going to impact China as well. So disruptions there are already hitting Chinese refiners, especially what they call the teapot refiners in China. It's forcing them to draw on their reserves and pay much more for replacement cargoes.
I think that's helpful sort of context setting to understand, like even at sort of first glance, we may assume that while it is a prudent strategy to think of diversification, there are the geographic realities of, if you have a lot of suppliers clustered in the same region and you have a choke point in the region, then suddenly you're in a position of vulnerability. So I think this is maybe a good moment for me to ask, a little bit more looking forward, right? We've talked a lot about what's been done to set up a nice cushion for China and some of its investments. But what direction do you think broadly you'd say that China's energy security is headed? Maybe if I had to put you in a tough spot and say, 3 key areas that you think would be worth keeping an eye out for.
Okay. So I think going ahead, at least 2 things are definitely going to happen is that they'll again start sort of sourcing from diversified supplies. So Russia might come to play a more sort of an increasing role in their supply sources. We already know that they have one pipeline with Russia and another one, which is the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline for LNG, is now going to pick up pace. So that's one. But there's another source, which is the US. And before the sanctions came in place, China already used to import crude oil and LNG from the US in LNG and LPG as well from the US in large quantities. But with the upcoming Trump and Xi summit, if that goes well, the US supplies might also be part of the mix again. So that's one, about further diversifying their energy supply sources or import sources. And the second is definitely the dual track approach, as we mentioned above, that will pick up pace. We'll see an increased focus on both renewables and even more so on coal, I think, after this crisis. Also, they have set the target of, I think, carbon peaking by 2030. With definite for the next 5 years, there's definitely going to be more and more sort of focus on building as much as coal power capacity that they can. So those are the 2 things. And the last thing I would say, that's there's going to be an increasing focus on sort of building out infrastructure, transmission infrastructure and storage infrastructure in the country. This is also something that we had seen being mentioned in the 15th five-year plan that recently came out. So there's definitely going to be more focus on these regional grids that connect renewable energy production hubs to energy consumption hubs. So, for example, if there's more renewable energy being generated in Inner Mongolia, there's very little consumption in Inner Mongolia itself, because all of the industries and industry clusters are in the Beijing-Hebei region. So there would be more focus on sort of this utilization of those energy production hubs for the industrial clusters. So there's definitely going to be a huge focus on building out infrastructure for this and helping the adoption of renewable energy more and more in India.
No, that's really helpful, I think, because I think what usually we'll find is as we're sort of staring and confronting some of these challenges, it's a helpful exercise to sort of see, okay, in what direction are we moving? And as a policy analyst, having a sense of being able to be a bit prescient and look forward to the future is always a helpful skill, I think, to have as much as possible. For those who are interested in reading a little bit more about this, Bhumika herself has written a fair bit about what China has done in its energy security space in particular. So I will encourage you to look up some of that. But apart from that, I just want to say thank you so much, Bhumika, for joining us. A real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Kripa, for hosting me.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.